The psychological profiles of famous criminals often reveal complex patterns of behavior and thought shaped by a range of factors, including upbringing, personality, mental illness, and environmental stresses. Understanding these profiles helps to identify common traits and motivations in criminal behavior, though each case remains unique. Below are brief psychological profiles of some infamous criminals. Ted Bundy, a notorious serial killer, was known for his charm, intelligence, and outward appearance of normalcy, which he used to lure his victims. He displayed traits of psychopathy, including a lack of empathy, shallow emotions, and manipulative behavior. Bundy was highly narcissistic and enjoyed the sense of power and control over his victims. He also showed sadistic tendencies, as his crimes often involved torture and mutilation. His violent behavior stemmed from deep-seated issues with control and dominance. His crimes were sexual in nature, and he later admitted to being driven by intense fantasies of violence and rape. Jeffrey Dahmer, a serial killer and cannibal, had a psychological profile pointing to severe mental disturbances, including necrophilia and cannibalism. He exhibited signs of schizotypal personality disorder, showing odd beliefs and behaviors, social isolation, and a detachment from reality. Dahmer was socially awkward and struggled to form meaningful relationships. He killed out of a desire to possess his victims completely and to prevent them from leaving him, indicating extreme abandonment issues. Dahmer's compulsion was rooted in his deep loneliness and desire for control. His killings allowed him to create an unresisting companion, fulfilling his fantasies of control and submission. John Wayne Gacy, infamously known as the Killer Clown, exhibited classic signs of antisocial personality disorder, including deceitfulness, lack of remorse, and a willingness to violate the rights of others. He led a double life, presenting himself as a successful businessman and community member while secretly engaging in horrific crimes. Gacy's predatory behavior towards young boys and men was likely driven by repressed sexual desires and intense feelings of inadequacy. His psychological profile suggests he may have committed murders to suppress his own insecurities, particularly regarding his sexuality. His outward charm and persona masked his darker, violent tendencies. Aileen Wuornos, a female serial killer, exhibited signs of borderline personality disorder, which includes emotional instability, intense fear of abandonment, and impulsive behavior. She had a traumatic childhood filled with abuse, neglect, and instability, which contributed to her deeply ingrained mistrust of others, particularly men. Wuornos's killings were not sadistic in the traditional sense, but appeared to be reactive and rooted in self-defense, at least in her perception. Wuornos claimed her killings were in response to attempted sexual assaults, and while this remains debated, her actions appear to have been driven by deep-seated anger, trauma, and a fight-or-flight response. Richard Ramirez, often known as the Night Stalker, was a serial killer whose crimes were characterized by extreme violence, sadism, and lack of empathy, suggesting psychopathic traits. He also displayed signs of a severe personality disorder, including extreme paranoia and delusions, which may have been exacerbated by drug use. Ramirez had a deep fascination with Satanism, and his crimes were ritualistic, indicating a desire to invoke fear and to gain a sense of power over his victims. His motivations were rooted in a need for control, dominance, and fear. His chaotic childhood, marked by exposure to extreme violence and a lack of parental guidance, likely contributed to his antisocial behaviors. Charles Manson, a notorious cult leader, had a charismatic, manipulative personality, which allowed him to control and influence vulnerable followers. He exhibited traits of narcissistic personality disorder, including grandiosity, a need for admiration, and a lack of empathy. Manson's belief in an impending race war, which he called helter-skelter, reflected paranoid delusions and perhaps elements of schizophrenia or schizotypal personality disorder. He displayed extreme paranoia, impulsivity, and a desire to project his internal chaos onto society. Manson's primary motivation was power and control over others, particularly his followers. His apocalyptic beliefs and delusions fueled his violent tendencies, but his ultimate goal was personal significance. Ed Gein, known as a grave robber and murderer, presents a deeply disturbing psychological profile. Gein's mental state suggests severe mental illness, likely psychosis and schizophrenia. He had an unhealthy attachment to his domineering mother, which led to a warped view of women and death. Living in isolation, Gein exhibited behaviors that indicated he had lost touch with reality, such as making clothing from human skin. His actions pointed to a profound inability to separate fantasy from reality. Gein's crimes were likely motivated by a deep desire to recreate his mother or to fill the void her death left. His inability to cope with reality and his fascination with corpses suggest a psychotic break. Dennis Rader, also known as the BTK killer. Rader's psychological profile aligns with psychopathy and narcissism. He displayed a facade of normalcy, working as a church leader and family man, while secretly harboring sadistic fantasies. Rader enjoyed the planning and execution of his crimes and often communicated with law enforcement to taunt them, indicating his need for attention and validation. His crimes were sexually motivated, and he derived pleasure from the suffering of his victims. Rader was driven by a need for power and control, both over his victims and in his ability to evade capture. His crimes were rooted in his desire for dominance and his sadistic tendencies. David Berkowitz, infamously known as the Son of Sam. Berkowitz's psychological profile reveals delusions and paranoia, pointing to possible paranoid schizophrenia. He claimed that a demon in the form of a neighbor's dog ordered him to commit the murders, reflecting a break from reality. Berkowitz had a troubled childhood and displayed early signs of social isolation and mental instability. His delusions played a significant role in his motivation, as he believed he was being commanded by supernatural forces. His lack of meaningful connections and possible feelings of rejection contributed to his violent outbursts. Anders Breivik, the mass murderer from Norway. Breivik exhibited traits of narcissism and possibly schizotypal personality disorder. He carried out his attacks with the belief that he was engaged in a larger ideological struggle, which points to extreme paranoia and grandiosity. While he was found not to be psychotic at the time of the attacks, his worldview was heavily influenced by delusional thinking and extremist ideologies. Breivik was motivated by far-right political beliefs and a desire to spark a revolution. His narcissistic belief in his own importance and his extreme ideological views led him to carry out a mass killing in an attempt to further his cause. Common traits in criminal profiles: psychopathy or sociopathy. Lack of empathy, manipulativeness, and superficial charm are common in many serial killers and violent criminals. Narcissism: many criminals display grandiosity, entitlement, and a need for admiration. Childhood trauma, abuse, neglect, and dysfunctional family environments are often precursors to criminal behavior. Control and power. A desire to dominate and control others, often fueled by feelings of inadequacy or rejection. Mental illness: conditions such as schizophrenia, borderline personality disorder, and antisocial personality disorder frequently appear in the backgrounds of violent criminals. While these profiles help to understand the underlying factors that contribute to criminal behavior, each criminal is unique, and a combination of genetic, psychological, and environmental influences often come into play. Profiling helps law enforcement and forensic psychologists in predicting patterns, though it cannot always explain or predict criminal behavior entirely.